right, so this is Philosophy 176, the classes on death. My name is Shelley Kagan, and the very first thing I want to do is to invite you to call me Shelley. That is, we meet on the street, you come talk to me during office hours, you ask some question. Shelley's the name that I respond to. I will eventually respond to Professor Kagan, but the synapses take a bit longer for that. It's not the name I immediately recognize. I have found that over the years, fewer and fewer students feel comfortable calling me Shelley. When I was young, it seemed to work. Now I'm gray and august. But as it is, Shelley, if you're comfortable with it, it's the name that I prefer to be called by. Now, as I say, this is a class on death, but it's a philosophy class, and what that means is that the set of topics that we're going to be talking about in this class are not identical to the topics that other classes on death might try to cover. So the first thing I want to do is say something about the things we won't be talking about that you might reasonably expect or hope that a class on death would talk about, so that if this is not the class you were looking for, you still have time to go check out some other class. So here are some things that a class on death could cover that we won't talk about. And what I primarily have in mind are sort of psychological and sociological questions about the nature of death or the phenomenon of death. And so a class on death might well have a discussion of the process of dying and coming to reconcile yourself with the fact that you're going to die. Some of you may know about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's discussion of the so-called 5 stages of dying. There's denial, and then there's anger, and then there's bargaining. I actually remember the 5 stages. We're not going to talk about that. Similarly, we're not going to talk about the funeral industry in America and how it rips off people, which it does, rips off people in their moments of grief and weakness and overcharges them for the various things that it offers. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the process of grieving or bereavement. We're not going to talk about sociological attitudes that we have towards the dying in our culture and how we tend to try to keep the dying hidden from the rest of us. These are all perfectly important topics, but they're not, as I say, topics that we're going to be talking about in this class. So what will we talk about? Well, the things we'll talk about are philosophical questions that arise as we begin to think about the nature of death. Like this. Here's, in broad scope, half the class is going to be, the first half of the class is going to be metaphysics, for those of you who are familiar with the philosophical piece of jargon. And roughly half the class, the second half of the class, is going to be value theory. So the first half of the class is going to be concerned with questions about the nature of death. What happens when we die? Indeed, to get at that question, the first thing we're going to have to think about is, what are we? What kind of an entity is a person? In particular, do we have souls? And for this class, when I talk about a soul, what I'm going to mean is sort of a bit of philosophical jargon, is I'm going to mean something immaterial, something distinct from our bodies. Do we have immaterial souls, something that might survive the death of our body? And if not, what does that imply about the nature of death? What kind of an event is death? What is it for me to survive? What would it mean for me to survive my death? What does it mean for me to survive tonight? That is, somebody's going to be here lecturing to the class on Thursday. Presumably that will be me. What is it for that person who's there on Thursday to be the same person as the person who's sitting here lecturing to you today? These are questions about the nature of personal identity. Pretty clearly, to think about death and continued existence and survival, we have to get clear about the nature of personal identity. These sorts of questions will occupy us for roughly the first half of the semester. And then we'll turn to value questions. If death is the end, is death bad? Now, of course, most of us are immediately and strongly inclined to think that death is bad, but there are a set of philosophical puzzles about how death could be bad. So to sort of give you a quick taste, if after my death I won't exist, how could anything be bad for me? How could anything be bad for something that doesn't exist? So how could death be bad? So it's not that the result's going to be I'm going to try to convince you that death isn't bad, but it takes actually a little bit of work to pin down precisely what is it about death that's bad and how can it be death. And is there more than one thing about death that makes it bad? We'll turn to questions like that. If death is bad, then one might wonder, would immortality be a good thing? And that's a question that we'll think about. Or more generally, we'll worry about how should the fact that I'm going to die affect the way I live? What should my attitude be towards my mortality? Should I be afraid of death, for example? Should I despair at the fact that I'm going to die? Finally, we'll turn to questions about suicide. Many of us think that given the valuable and precious thing that life is, suicide makes no sense. You're throwing away the only life you're ever going to have. And so we'll end the semester by thinking about questions along the lines of the rationality and morality of suicide. So roughly speaking, that's where we're going. First half of the class, metaphysics. Second half of the class, value theory. Next thing I need to explain is this. There's, roughly speaking, two ways to do a class, especially an introductory class like this. In approach number one, you simply lay out the various positions, pro and con, and the professor strives to remain neutral, sort of not tip his hand about what he holds. That's approach number one, and sometimes in my intro classes, that's the approach that I take. But the other approach, and the one that I should warn you I'm going to take this semester in this class, is rather different. There's a line that I'm going to be developing, pushing, if you will, or defending in this class. That is to say, there's a certain set of views I hold about the issues that we'll be discussing, and what I'm going to try to do in this class is argue for those views, try to convince you that those views are correct. To help you know sort of ahead of time quickly what those views are, I want to start by describing a set of views that many of you probably believe. So I'm going to give you a cluster of views. Logically speaking, you could believe some of these things and not all of them. But here's a set of views that many of you probably believe, and I imagine most of you believe at least some of these things. So here's the set of common views. First of all, that we have a soul. That is to say, we're not just bodies, we're not just lumps of bone and flesh, but there's a part of us, perhaps the essential part of us, that is something more than the physical, the spiritual, immaterial part of us, which, as I say in this class, we'll call a soul. So most of us, most of you probably believe in soul. Certainly most people in America believe in some sort of immaterial soul. And given this existence of this immaterial soul, it's a possibility, indeed, a fair likelihood that we will survive our deaths. The death will be the destruction of my body, but my soul is immaterial, and so my soul can continue to exist after my death. And whether or not you actually believe in a soul, you hope that there's a soul, so that there'll be this serious possibility of surviving your death. Because death is not only bad, but so horrible that what we would like to have happen is we would like to live forever. And so armed with a soul, as it were, there's at least the possibility of immortality. Immortality would be wonderful. That's what we hope is the case, whether or not we know that it's the case. Immortality would be wonderful. That's why death's so bad. It robs us of immortality. And if there is no soul, if death is the end, if there is no immortality, this is such an overwhelmingly bad thing that the obvious reaction, the natural reaction, the universal reaction is to face the prospect of death with fear and despair. And as I mentioned earlier, then death is so horrible and life is so wonderful that it could never make sense to throw it away. And so suicide is both immoral on the one hand and never makes sense. It's always irrational as well, in addition. All right. That, as I say, is, I think, a common set of views about the nature of death. And what I'm going to be doing, what I'm going to be arguing in this class is that that set of views is pretty much mistaken from beginning to end. And so I'm going to try to convince you that there is no soul, immortality would not be a good thing, fear of death isn't actually an appropriate response to death, suicide under certain circumstances might be rationally, morally justified. As I say, the common picture is pretty much mistaken from start to end. That's at least my goal. That's my aim. That's what I'm going to be doing. Now, since, of course, I believe the views I believe in, I hope at the end of the semester you'll agree with me, because I think they're true, and I hope you'll end up believing the truth. But I should say that the crucial point isn't for you to agree with me. The crucial point is for you to think for yourself. And so what I'm really doing is inviting you to take a good, cold, hard look at death, and to face it and think about it in a way that most of us don't do. If you, at the end of the semester, haven't agreed with me about this particular claim or that particular claim, so be it. I'll be content, I won't be completely content, but I'll be at least largely content as long as you've really thought through the arguments on each side of these various issues. Carrie, maybe this would be a good time to pass around the syllabus. All right. Next, introductory remarks. A lot of today's talk is going to be devoted to business. I'll get to, if time permits, some philosophy at the end. I want to make one more remark about what I'll be doing in terms of this class. This class, as I say, is a philosophy class. We'll basically be sitting here thinking about what we can know or make sense of with regard to death using our reasoning capacity. We'll be trying to think about death from a rational standpoint. One kind of evidence or one kind of argument that we won't be making use of here is appeal to religious authority. So some of you may believe in, for example, the existence of an afterlife. You may believe you're going to survive your death. You may believe in immortality because that's what your church teaches you. And that's fine. It's not my purpose or intention here to try to argue you out of your religious beliefs or to argue against your religious beliefs. All I'm going to ask is that we not appeal to such religious arguments, appeal to revelation or the authority of the Bible or what have you, in the course of this argument, in the course of this class. If you want to, you could think of this class as one big hypothetical. What conclusions would we come to about the nature of death if we had to think about it from a secular perspective, making use of only our own reasoning as opposed to whatever answers we might be given by divine revealed authority. Those of you who believe in divine revealed authority, that's a debate for another day. It's not a debate that we're going to be engaged in here in this semester. And similarly, although I'm not going to ask you in your discussion sections to hide your religious views, you'll be asked, in the course of defending them, to give reasons that would make sense to all of us. All right. That's by way of sort of where the class is going. Let me now turn to some discussion about the requirements of the class, grades, and so forth and so on. The syllabus is going around the class. Almost all of you have it at this point. The syllabus doesn't really say a whole lot. I've already given you an overview of what topics we'll be going to. The crucial point about the syllabus is that it indicates what reading you need to have done for any given week. Now, I've done my best to peg the readings to where I will be on that week's lectures, but